Welcome back to the program. Accusations of rape and horrific human rights abuses have plagued South Sudan. To delve deeper into the humanitarian plight of the South Sudanese people, I'm joined by Ayo Johnson. He is an African affairs specialist. He joins us from London. And we have Neda Mustafa Ali. She is a fellow at the University of Massachusetts. She's taught in Sudan and joins us today from Boston. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Before we get to the humanitarian situation in South Sudan, Ayo Johnson, I want to ask you about this latest peace agreement. Do you think peace is coming to Sudan?
It will have to. We're hoping. We've had too many of these. We've had peace agreements signed, not kept. We've had warring sides agreeing to stop fighting. They haven't kept it. We're hoping that the leaders will show greater leadership this time around, Mr. Michel and Salva Kiir, putting away their petty differences and their squabbles, and ultimately think about the wider Sudan, South Sudan, and its issues for which the wider population is at stake, because many women and children are affected, displacement, not to mention countless of thousands who've already lost their lives. We are all hoping that the leadership that exists right now in South Sudan will be mature enough to see that this comes to a pass.
Neda, we know that this war has taken its toll on the civilian population. Something like 6.5 million people have been affected. And at this stage, those are the people who need assistance. And at this stage, we also know that something like 2 million people have been displaced. What is your take on the humanitarian situation right now?
Well, the humanitarian situation, as the statistics show, and we have to be careful with the statistics, but these are UN statistics, of course, is dire, unfortunately. And as several observers have said, behind each statistic there is a woman, a man, and a child. What I would like to say is that South Sudan has had some of the worst South Sudan has had some of the worst human development indicators even before the war erupted on the 15th of December 2013, before this violence started. So we know that South Sudan, for example, had very high rates of maternal mortality, the death of a woman while giving birth or 42 days afterwards. It is 2,054 deaths per 100,000 live births in South Sudan, and child mortality was also very high at 102 deaths per 1,000 births. These are absolutely devastating statistics. And so in situations of crisis, the whole population is usually affected, but groups and social groups and individuals that had been vulnerable even before the eruption of violence would be even more affected by such a situation, by such a dire situation. And I just think that this is really terrible. There had been reports, of course, of rape and other forms of sexual violence. Again, there are no accurate statistics, and we should also remember that reporting is usually very low in these cases because of the high stigma and fear associated with rape in settings like South Sudan and elsewhere, and also because of the general lack of adequate channels for reporting and for addressing such atrocities.
Ayo, what kind of international assistance is there in South Sudan right now to assist people in the kind of major humanitarian problems that Neda's been outlining there?
There are camps in place, there are feeding centers, there are clothing centers for women and children, and not to mention children who need to go to school, for which school is not very much apparent, but nonetheless there are some mechanisms in place. The World Health Organization has also sent doctors and nurses to help. I'm afraid it's all hands on deck in terms of South Sudan. It's a very fragile country. That element of fragility was pushed with the last couple of years, with the saga that we've seen explode between Mr. Mustafa and Salva Kiir, and of course their warring parties. We have also seen the displacement of women and children. So it's helping those people to be able to keep life at bay, maintain the status quo under very difficult and exhausting circumstances. And of course, when you talk about the a very weak infrastructure, non-existent in many places. You have very, very poor governance. So the trickle down hasn't materialized for the vast majority of South Sudanese who've not seen the huge potential wealth that that country has, especially to do with oil, which has not been materialized across the board thus far.
Nila, what do you know about international assistance in South Sudan? A lot of international organizations have pulled out. In fact, one of the last major ones to pull out was Doctors Without Borders. They pulled out after their hospital came under fire from government forces. So who's left there right now to assist people?
Well, there is a huge humanitarian operation in South Sudan. As you probably know, there are, there is humanitarian assistance from the United Nations. One of the largest operations worldwide are in South Sudan. There are about 150 NGOs, international non-governmental organizations that were registered in South Sudan with the NGOs Forum. Yes, some of the major organizations had to pull out. And these organizations were playing important roles, but there are also other local organizations that have been playing important roles in addressing the humanitarian needs, but also working on more structural issues, trying to build consensus and peace at the grassroots level within South Sudan, working with women and other social groups in the south. Perhaps I could talk about that a little later. But I mean, there is a humanitarian operation in South Sudan. NGOs are working under difficult circumstances. Some of them had to pull out, because of the security situation, obviously, but still there is some presence in South Sudan, of course, for organizations.
Is the African Union doing all it can to alleviate the situation in South Sudan? We know that one of its committees carried out an investigation, and the report that it produced was not tabled. It was not made public.
Not made public. The timing was questioned. There were fears that Mr. Salva Kiir, Mr. Machar would be implicated, and it wouldn't be in the better interest for them to be discussing peace when there were other issues hanging over their heads. There have also been issues around child soldiers who have been accused on both sides of using exploitation of women and children, the entire country hijacked. Yes, there are all these pains, all these problems, which the African Union doesn't feel needs to be pressured on these leaders who, at this moment in time, need to start talking, which they are, but ultimately they need to start thinking correctly in the interest of the wider country, which has hijacked the entire process for a very long time.
Nila, tell us about those programs that you just mentioned a moment ago to try and get people back on their feet in South Sudan. One of the other things I also want to look at is, the people who've carried out these human rights atrocities, are they ever going to be brought to justice?
Well, that's a very important and very complicated question as well. Just on the issue of the report, I think there is a need actually to make the results of the investigation public. And the South Sudan Law Society has called for that, along with a number of other local organizations and civil society leaders. I think that's absolutely important. With impunity always is always going to affect justice and peace as well. It should never be an either-or situation. Regarding some of the initiatives that have been ongoing in South Sudan and also at the regional level, one of my observations is that the reporting, of course, the situation in South Sudan, as we said earlier, is absolutely dire. But the reporting on such crises often tends to overlook, the very positive, small-scale, perhaps, initiatives taking place by the local population, at the grassroots level and nationally as well.
Yeah, Ayo, there is also a major challenge when it comes to the security of young men, boys, actually. There's a Human Rights Watch report which was published on Monday, earlier this week. It says South Sudan's military are recruiting children. They're enlisting boys, some of them as young as 13 years old. How bad is the child soldier problem in South Sudan?
It's a massive problem in South Sudan. It's been well documented. It's very exhausting and very depressing. Both sides haven't seen to stop the recruitment of children. It's a war crime. It's a crime against the right of the children. And of course, one of the questions is, how do you get the competence of into rehabilitation, reconciliation, and above all, integrated back into society. Many of these children who have been taken from their parents, many of them who have been given exhausting training, coming back into the community is going to become a problem. Reintegration is a major challenge, and the programs at the moment are not up to speed to be able to cater for some of these kids who find themselves in harm's way and who have already taken part in combat. And of course, both Mr. Salva Kiir and Mr. Machar more than likely will be facing charges from the International Criminal Court at some point in relation to some of these, which is becoming a sticky headache for the African Union in terms of its report, and very much in terms of not applying too much pressure for individuals who are key stakeholders who may have committed crimes that for the ones you've just expressed.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Ayo Johnson in London, Neda Mustafa Ali in Boston. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at @CCTV_America. I'm Aaron Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.